Welcome back to my channel. I'm Traben, and in today's video we'll be doing a review for Paul Tremblay's horror movie, a book that makes me think about it, but the more I think about it, the less I like it. Let's talk about it. Oh my goodness, guys, I don't know even where to start with this one. I'll just jump straight in and just start giving my thoughts, because I wrote down notes this time, guys. I have like pages and pages of notes. Finished it up and I just it's got so many complicated things going on with it. The book overall has this framework that I feel like insulates it from criticism, which is bad. So if you've ever watched a movie designed to be a B movie, you might have some idea of what I'm talking about, where people will say like the acting was terrible, this premise was incredibly stupid, you know, like Sharknado, Octo Shark versus Giant Wolf, whatever. There'll be these terrible movies and people will be like, well, of course, like they're supposed to be terrible, they're like horrible B movie things. And I feel like this is the same way. Like, just because you create something that is pretentious and bad and you call attention to its pretentiousness within the text doesn't stop it from being pretentious. Before I get into all that, let's talk about the premise here. So we have an unnamed narrator that we'll just refer to as like the thin kid or the narrator for my notes and things, who was involved in a movie production years ago with a bunch of like amateur filmmakers. That movie has now gone on to obtain a cult status because one, everybody who's associated with it is dead at this point except for him, but like they all died of completely different reasons years apart from each other. So like I don't quite get why that matters. And two, there was something that happened on set that the movie could not be completed, and that's what they tease out for the entirety of the book until like the second to last chapter. We'll get into that later on. I will let you know when there's spoilers. The movie premise is that there are these kids that take a like shy kid, put a mask over his face, start abusing him essentially, and it's all in an effort to create a monster. It sounds like the kind of like artsy, pretentious, like art house horror movie kind of thing. They told the protagonist when he's in the mask like not to talk, and they give him the director gives him dirty looks if he says anything or tries to make any jokes. It very much seems like psychological manipulation in a lot of places, and even the narrator points out like, I'm pretty sure that these events happened so that I would suggest we do something that was more extreme and was going to end up hurting me in this scene. And I don't know, it was really that part was actually kind of creepy. That part was actually working for me. There are some parts in the book where he will say something that you find out later is a line out of the script. He does talk about his inability to remember what actually happened versus what didn't happen because he just remembers the movie, he just remembers the filming. And there is at least one point where we get two separate stories for a major point in his life, for a major thing that occurred, and he tells one to a person at a convention, and then he tells one basically to the reader because he is narrating this as a audiobook. And so we get the sense that the second story is the real story, because we have this character who admits that he can't distinguish fantasy from reality and that he remembers things two different ways. And also, when it comes to the climax of the book, him saying, like, maybe this happened or maybe this happened, he doesn't recall, it makes it to where it's very hard to trust anything that he says. and it makes the ending even more complicated to discuss. So the framework of the book is that the narrator is now narrating an audiobook about his experiences being approached to create a remake of the book, or I'm sorry, a remake of the movie, which is, I think, just called Horror Movie. And that is intercut. The audiobook that he is recording is then intercut with the script for the original horror movie that he was involved in. Make sense? It's a very convoluted setup. And I will talk about why it doesn't work and why that breaks down as we go on. Going back to that idea of how it insulates itself from criticism, it will describe scenes from this movie that are really bad ideas and have these really pretentious notes from whoever wrote the script about how it's supposed to impact the audience. I'm going to highlight the scene in which they suggest to hold on the frame of a doorway within a house for 5 full minutes before, with no change whatsoever, before the villain jumps into frame and attacks the person who's waiting downstairs, like whose point of view we're seeing things in. Now, I like A24 films. I like The Babadook and The Witch and all these kind of more cerebral horror films, like artsy horror films. That still sounds insufferable to me. There is this digression of, well, really, people are just going to get bored, right? And then, like, are people really going to be thinking these things? Just because that's there doesn't make that a bad idea. So that would be fine in isolation. But then what ends up happening is the larger story starts to subsume these ideas from the script and make them part of the book. Again, it's hard to articulate what I'm saying, but there's several points where the narrator says that he can't remember how things actually happened. He just remembers what happened in the script. And there are times where he will say things that come straight out of the script. So there is this like this blending of the script logic and the script outlook and the main character's logic and the main character's outlook. And it ultimately resolves itself in a completely unnecessary final chapter. These ideas with the unreliable narrator and the framing device of the script, the blending of fantasy and reality, work against the overall messaging of the book because it's completely unclear what we can trust about anything this character says, and the end makes absolutely no sense in reality. Like the last chapter, as it's described, could not possibly have actually happened. So I don't quite know what's real and what's fake, and that's bad in this case because it really matters that that's the last takeaway of the book. This is trying to be this like postmodern breakdown of author and audience, and I feel like it's trying too hard. That becomes muddled because of that very framing device we're dealing with. I'm going to get into spoilers now because there's no way to satisfyingly discuss this book and the issues I have with its ending without talking about the last chapter and the second to last chapter. So skip to this timestamp here if you don't want to get any spoilers. The biggest issue with the book is that the main conflict is resolved by the end of the second to last chapter. The entire time that the book's been going, we've been teasing at something happened on set to make it to where the last shot couldn't be filmed or one of the shots couldn't be used, and we get the growing sense because of the kind of deranged character we're seeing this from, that something happened where someone got hurt on set. And so we finally see that in the second to last chapter. So another blending of the script and reality is that everybody who's playing a role in the original script uses their real names as their character names. Hard to differentiate between like movie Cleo and real Cleo, and that breakdown of reality is core to the messaging of the book. We get to the end and we find out that it was Cleo, the scriptwriter, who ends up getting killed on set. What happens is they have this final scene with a chainsaw. They set up a protective thing with a piece of wood and her like laid over this table. The camera angle is such that you can't see her face. They go into a lot of detail on like how they were setting this up to where you couldn't really tell what was happening. And so you wouldn't see that she was actually relatively safe during the shooting of the scene. But as they go to actually shoot the scene, when they have a real chain on the chainsaw, she moves into the chainsaw, and she purposefully like lifts herself up and pushes it into her. The death scene is another one where this unreliable narrator concept becomes problematic for the telling of the story, because we do have a character who's admitted that they don't remember what happens, they don't remember things clearly, and they say that they don't think that they, pushed into Cleo when she was leaning up to, do this assisted suicide thing. Establish that your character can't be trusted. The only thing that really bolsters this perception is that there was a court case afterwards, and within the court case they came to the conclusion that you can tell in the video that she was sitting up and leaning into the chainsaw. So that's the only like sliver of corroboration for this telling of the story. But the way that he goes about denying it and saying I don't think I did this makes it really suspect. And again, it's another point where having this unreliable narrator and having this breakdown between your fantasy element within your fantasy book, this movie element, this blending of movie and reality, and this unreliable narrator works against the narrative, because you cannot ever be sure what he's telling you is true. This is at least a satisfying conclusion, ? It's at least a sensical conclusion, because we have had talk of Cleo's character within the story, talking about trying to find a way to accidentally kill herself. She puts her hands in her pockets when she's walking upstairs, and there's a character who talks to her about it within the film and says like, oh, I know this is the thing you're going through, like, let's not do that. Her idea is like she can't bring herself to kill herself, but she is trying to create situations where it could accidentally happen. And so then there's a talk later on in the book between real life Cleo and the narrator, where he's asking like how much of the script is you versus how much is just like things that you've made up. Like, are you okay? Are you thinking about suicide? And she's like, oh yeah, like it's me and it's not me, but like I'm okay. And so there was at least foreshadowing that Cleo had this problem, had this desire through the like hints of the script and the things that she talked about, that this was something that could happen. Now, is Cleo a terrible person for making everybody in this film like an accessory to her murder-suicide? Absolutely. But at the very least, it's a satisfying end to the arc that we are actually alluding to, actually foreshadowing up to that point. And it's the payoff for the main mystery of the book. The final chapter starts. The final chapter starts off with, there's probably nothing I can add that would be satisfying for this. It's not going to add anything new. There's not a big reveal about where the mask came from the movie, because there's some mystery revolving around that. It then goes on to describe the narrator character, who we've had this suspicion that he is having trouble disassociating with the character Thin Man in the script. Like, he has done things. He has like patches on his body that are like tattoos that are similar to the things that happened in the movie when he became a monster. And okay, all right. So in the last chapter, he goes and he stalks the Thin Man actor for the reboot movie, follows him back to his trailer, sets up a bunch of cameras, and then proceeds to kill him, put on his mask, and then supposedly change his body to look like the younger person, because he's in the narrator's in like his 50s now, so there's no way that he could pass himself off as a younger kid, which is like what the current character is playing, right? It makes absolutely no sense, and it adds nothing to the story. I don't care about the narrator, in all honesty. Like, he's not an interesting character. This whole like creating a monster storyline where he was like told to be quiet while he was wearing the mask, and the whole plot of the movie was developing a monster and then he became a monster, is so cliche and stupid. Like, it was already stupid with the movie plot, right? It was already heavy-handed and like did not work with the script within the book. It certainly doesn't work when you try to apply it to the character itself. And the bigger problem is that he is supposedly recording an audiobook. He refers to it as an audiobook several times, and he's recording it while he's doing this. It doesn't work. The whole framing device breaks down in the last chapter, and it really brings into question whether or not anything in that last chapter happened, whether or not anything supernatural is occurring in the book. And that lack of clarity is not good for the book. It muddles what would have otherwise been a pretty straightforward, if a little bit slow moving story of a production hampered by impressionable youths who were struggling with mental things. We could have had some kind of takeaway from it. We could have had some kind of lesson to learn from it. Instead, we get whatever nonsense was in that last chapter, which completely like glosses over the actual main thrust of the narrative in favor of something that is more spectacle over substance. And again, like, is that a point that the author is trying to make about horror movies and this kind of pretentious horror movie? Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that he pointed out that last chapter was useless, and then it ended up being useless. That last chapter was still useless. I still did not like it. It was still bad. Just because you point out that it's a bad choice does not make it a good choice. And so, yeah, I started off this book and I was like, 4 stars? Maybe. Like, I started, like, when I got to the second to last chapter, I was like, I actually liked where the story went. It was actually like an interesting thing, and I liked some of the playing with what was real, what was not real, what was a fabricated story, how did these events really happen, was it in the movie script or was it happening in real life? But I felt like at the end of that second to last chapter, I was like, okay, yeah, that was a satisfying end. And then the last chapter happened. I was like, what? And the more I think about it, the lower this book gets. The book being a critique of the type of horror movies that it seems to be lampooning by pointing out their pretentiousness does not itself protect it from those same criticisms when it becomes pretentious garbage at the end. And I really hated that last chapter. It was awful. Had it ended one chapter earlier, had the last chapter been more of a reflection and a meditation on the narrator's difficulty with parsing what really happened, what didn't happen, his conflicting emotions about being a part of this or about creating, being a part of being part of the reboot of the story, that would have been appropriate. It would have been better than what we got for sure. But that last chapter really, really messes it up. It's really bad. And so, yeah, right now I'm at a 3 out of 5. Like, I still feel like there was something salvageable out of this book. I just feel like the more I think about it, the more I think about it, the worse it gets. I feel like there's something salvageable about it. I do think that a good number of the characters are not very fleshed out or interesting. I did like Cleo's character. I did like some of the stuff that was happening with the narrator. It just did not come together in any kind of satisfying way at the end for the resolution of the story overall. And yeah, I don't know. I'd be hard pressed to recommend this to very many people because it does play on so many levels, and ultimately I don't think the end result is something that is worth the amount of thinking you have to do unpacking what happens in this book. So that's my takeaway. It was good up to a point, and then took a wild turn at the end that I did not care for. I would recommend this if you are... So from what I've heard, this is basically Pallbearers Club Part 2. Maybe you would enjoy Pallbearers Club more. I started reading that one and never went back to it, never finished it. Perhaps I should go back and kind of see where the parallels are. If you're a fan of unreliable narrators, I suppose, you might want to give this one a shot. Or if you like fiction within fiction and the breaking of barriers between real and imagined events, that kind of thing, that play with those ideas. There are some interesting concepts throughout this book that you might find enjoyable, but again, I warn that the ending is just bad. The last chapter was a mistake. And that's going to do it for this review. As always, I hope your reading journey is going well. I hope you're finding things that make you think, and then as you think about them, you like them more. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The number one thing you can do to help us grow this channel is hit that thumbs up button. If you've read through Paul Tremblay's horror movie or any of Paul Tremblay's other works, give your comments down below. Give me your thoughts on his writing style. I've read a couple of his short story collections. I started the Pallbearers Club, so I have some sense of his writing style, but let me know your thoughts if you've read this book, and I hope to see you on the next one. Until then, take care.